Hello and welcome to Always Take Notes. In this episode, Rachel and myself speak with the novelist Michelle Paver.
We spoke to Michelle about moving from biochemistry to law to a literary career, about her best-selling Wolf Brothers series, and about her latest book, Rainforest.
It's a great episode and we hope you enjoy.
Michelle, welcome to Always Take Notes.
Thank you very much.
Live at Wimbledon BookFest. Let's start with the new book. Give us a kind of précis of Rainforest and where the idea for it came from.
Rainforest, yay. What's it about? Well, the name says it all. It's set in a rainforest. My hero, he's been knocked sideways by a tragedy in his life. He's a scientist, bit of a loner. Some might call him a stalker. And he takes refuge in the Mexican rainforest, an archaeological dig, and he thinks he's escaping from his past. It's crewed by a motley selection of Westerners, including, and also Mayans, modern-day indigenous people who are descendants of the ones they're digging up. And one of those is a shaman who says he can contact the dead. And of course, Simon doesn't want to have anything to do with that. But he does really. He's desperate to contact his dead. Well, he is until it starts to happen. So that's Rainforest in a nutshell. It came at the end of a prolonged period of writer's drought, actually. I didn't even know I had writer's drought. I just lost all interest in writing for about 10 months, and eventually the penny dropped. And I thought, this is probably what people mean by writer's drought. I got some therapy, and the result was Rainforest after about 3 months.
Could you tell us about the role of obsession in the novel? So as you allude to, the central character has definitely an obsessive streak, both in his relationship with Penelope, but also in his interest in mantids and the insects that he studies. Tell us about how that developed as a theme.
You know, themes are not something that I ever plan. I am a planner when I'm writing. I always like to know where the story's going. I get to know my characters and I write the biography of them. But the themes I've learnt, you know, you just let those rise up naturally. They come up from my unconscious anyway. So I knew he was going to be a bit obsessive, just because I think most good scientists are, and perhaps I have some affinity with that. I've read biochemistry at university, and I think maybe novelists have to be a bit obsessive as well, you know. So it comes naturally to make him that. Mantids, yes, if anyone's scared of praying mantises, well, so am I, actually. I used to find them very scary as a child, but it just seemed to be the natural thing for someone to be quite obsessive, to be a scientist, and then to go and hunt for these things in a rainforest. So that's a long, wittering answer to your question, Simon. The short answer is I don't know, because these things come up from the unconscious.
Wasn't wittering at all. Simon is an entomologist in the novel, so how deep did you have to go into the world of insects? How obsessive did you have to become to render his obsession kind of authentically?
I probably overdid it a bit, but then I usually do, because the thing about research I find is that you don't know which bit's going to be really useful. So you have to do quite a lot, and it's usually in the footnote to the footnote that you find the thing that, oh, that's going to give me, you know, a whole episode or something. Plus, the story's set in the early 70s. It's set in 1973. So I just wanted to make sure that the state of knowledge was, you know, as of 1973. That's where online second-hand bookshops are incredibly useful. I discovered them in the pandemic, actually. And fantastic, because then you can go right back to 1973. So fairly obsessive, I'd say.
You've listed M.R. James as an inspiration, but also very different writers like Henry James, Anthony Trollope, Rudyard Kipling, Edith Wharton. How important is the kind of tradition of ghost stories and the canon and the genre for you when you're working on a book like Rainforest?
Oh, that's a great question, because if you'd asked me about any other sort of genre, I'd have said not at all, ignore it, But it really important when I wrote or set out to write my first ghost story, Dark Matter. I reread M.R. James, and I read a biography of M.R. James, and I was fascinated to learn that he had actually studied his admired predecessor, Sheridan Le Fanu, and really analysed how he'd written his stories. And I don't normally do that. But I thought, well, if M.R. James did it, I think I will too. And so I analysed some of his short stories, his great ghost stories. And that really helped me, and I looked at Edith Wharton's ghost stories. It's partly just the way those storytellers got you turning the pages, but also the sort of principles of a good ghost story. And there really were some that you could sort of, I typed them up on mauve paper, because mauve was the colour of my Dark Matter notes, just sort of ghostly. And it sounds rather forensic, doesn't it, with a ghost story, but it's a strange genre, because I think you do have to be quite analytical on one level, and then once you've got that in place, the fascinating thing is the sort of spooks come up from underneath, from the unconscious, and things you can't plan, and it's that combination that ends up with, I hope, a good ghost story.
I wondered if something like Frankenstein was an influence as well, because it's not really a framing device in Rainforest, but he's writing as if he knows it's going to be read. He's addressing someone else. I wondered if that was kind of something that you were drawing
actually, on. That's an interesting one, Rachel. Frankenstein hasn't been a great influence to me. It's not one I warm to enormously, perhaps because it's more sort of scientific, that aspect of it. But yes, there are framing devices. I have to stop myself from using them. In Dark Matter, there's the opening letter. It's just a nice way of foreshadowing, what's going to come. And the thing I always love about writing sort of supernatural stories, it's quite often I'm in the first person, and your protagonist doesn't know they're in a ghost story, but the reader knows it, and so all the way you're sort of saying it's behind you, and that's where a framing device can really help.
How do you see these adult and sometimes very adult projects like Rainforest or Dark Matter or Thin Air compared to writing for a younger audience? And is there an overlap in your readers between them?
There's a huge overlap, actually. I was astonished to find when I wrote Dark Matter, which I thought was very dark. This is polar exploration, and then this young man is marooned in this isolated cabin during the polar night when it's dark all the time. All sorts of metaphysical implications in that. And then, I've had 12-year-old boys coming up and saying, oh, that was brilliant, They're reading it on a different level. Some of them will get the metaphysics, others will just think, oh, this is really scary. Conversely, with the Wolf Brother books, the series set in the Stone Age, which I wrote for 12-year-olds because there's a 12-year-old protagonist, I get 24-year-olds, 60-year-olds, 80-year-olds coming along, and quite a lot of them have grown up with the books, and then when I wrote 3 more, after 10 years, they read them as grown-ups and saw different things in them. So, yeah, that's lovely, very unexpected. In terms of writing, I don't actually see that much of a difference. Obviously, I've got to keep my language cleaner when I'm writing for children, and I suppose the one difference I would say is that I try not to be unremittingly dark if I'm writing for children. I don't want any child to come away from one of my children's books feeling worse about the world than when they started. I want them to feel better, even though it can go into some quite dark places. I have no such qualms when I'm writing for adults. But in terms of style, I see them all as a bit of a continuum. There's an awful lot in these books about just the possibilities of the human mind. Whether you're a 12-year-old in the Stone Age 6,000 years ago, imagining that the forest is watching you, or someone marooned in the rainforest, things may be happening in your mind that are quite strange, and it's that I enjoy writing about.
Well, and of course the techniques are the same. And you mentioned foreshadowing and creating that kind of atmosphere. Yeah. But how do you conjure kind of sustained dread in readers? It's a pretty hard question, but
it's a very hard thing to do, actually. And in the writing, I find I do it in sort of layers. My what I call my first draft. You know, I've done all my planning and my research, and then I know roughly what's going to happen in the story, and I do the bit I hate, which is the writing from scratch, and then I type it up and polish it, and eventually I get through the whole story, and that's my first draft. And it's usually pretty rubbish in terms of scares or spookiness, because I've been so concentrated on getting the story told and introducing the characters and things that the spooky bits, which I have planned, will be sort of dotting it, a bit like a currant bun or something. It just doesn't feel right. The first time that happened with Dark Matter, I was really in the depths of despair, but then I thought, oh, come on, you know, rewrite, that's what we do. And so gradually with each rewrite, I go from a currant bun to the whole cake being sort of permeated with brandy, you know, spooks. Sorry, mixed metaphors, but it's a question of, it's not just spooky bits. I suppose in filmic terms, do you know the expression a jump scare? You know, those are overused when something leaps out at you and goes, wow. You can't rely on too many of those, but it's the language you use quite often. To give an example from Dark Matter, when he's sailing up to the Arctic, Jack, the hero, is in a very small cabin. And I think I said, he's writing a journal, he says, my cabin's the size of a coffin. He could have said it's the size of a box room or something. But if you use a word that's a little bit nasty, it just creates a slight sense, particularly as I said, the reader knows he's in a ghost story. So they're sort of alert in a way that Jack isn't.
Do you think it's different, or maybe just harder for authors today to engender real fear in a reader, given how inured we are to TV and to film and very visual forms of horror compared to someone writing in the 19th century, say?
Gosh, that's fascinating. It might be, but I think that might... I'm going to have to choose my words carefully, but that might have more to do with the ability to concentrate. A book is a book, and you need to concentrate on it to get some sort of atmosphere from it. So it might be harder. I think it's probably harder to write because I don't feel that. M.R. James could. He was an Edwardian, so he could be fairly leisurely and perhaps only have one particular scare. At the end of that was an interesting scream coming from the library.
Someone's reading one of your books.
Yeah, quite. Whereas I think you've got to perhaps, it probably is more difficult, but for all sorts of complicated reasons.
You touched on this in an earlier answer, but to what extent do you plan everything all the way through in terms of the plot points and the twists, and then how much does it change? I think you'd said, you have a rough outline or a pretty good outline of what you want to achieve, but then do you, during that editing process, change it a lot, or is it kind of sharpening it?
Yes, I think a plan, perhaps the word plan is misleading. A plan it's not a blueprint. Some authors can get quite sniffy if they don't plan. They say, you plan, as if it's sort of writing by numbers, and you slot in the character. No, it's not like that. I like to know, particularly with a supernatural novel, I like to know what the climax is going to be, where I'm heading. I probably plan too much because however carefully I plan, it always changes a huge amount. And I have different levels of planning. I have a plan for the haunt, which is separate from the plan of what's happening in the so-called real world. But it changes so much. And that's the fascinating thing. During what I call the first draft, I'm getting to know what the story's about.
We wanted to come back to the recent work in due course, but can we roll back now to your early life? You were born in Nyasaland, now Malawi. Mm-hmm. You came to England when you were 3. What was it like coming to the UK, given neither your parents were British?
that was quite nice. I mean, I moved to Wimbledon when I was 8, 9, and I felt slightly exotic at school. I mean, I could speak English, so, most of the time I felt English because, this was all the only country I'd ever known. But in some ways, if anyone sort of criticised England, I would be English, but in some ways I wasn't. There was just that difference. My father was South African, my mother is Belgian, so it just lent a certain exoticism, although I always wished it had been slightly more exotic, something like Russian and French, would have been a bit better.
And it sounds like the writing bug bit early. I read somewhere that your first story was when you were 5, and it was an adventure about an escaped Tyrannosaurus Rex and a rabbit called Hamish. I would love to know more about what those two were up to.
Well, I actually can't. I mean, I remember the illustration I drew of the Tyrannosaurus Rex, or rather my mother drew the Tyrannosaurus Rex and I coloured it in green. Not much happened in that one, but the next day I wrote Ebony the Mouse Goddess on my mum's typewriter, and she kept that one. She didn't keep the one about Hamish, but I've still got a copy of Ebony the Mouse Goddess, and yeah, the mouse is away, but the mouse god is away, but so the mouse god is in charge, and the glacier threatens the village, and so she gets them all away. So early interest in mythology and animals and the far north.
And given also that early, clear literary interest, what then took you to study biochemistry at university?
I was just interested in science, actually. I mean, it was the time when genetic engineering was just sort of coming up, and it just really fascinated me. And someone gave me some very good advice. They just said, do what you want to do at university, study what you want to do, don't sort of focus on a career. I don't know if that would be good advice these days, but I thought, well, I just really like to do that. I had a fuzzy idea of going off to Africa and being a sort of another Jane Goodall. But then I realised that although I loved biochemistry, I was rubbish in the lab. I really was not a scientist, so I made a quick and stupid decision to study law.
But you were writing the whole time you were a student as well, including something that was the kind of seed of Wolf Brother, is that right?
I was very keen. I think, I mean, it sounds so ignoble to say it, but the original impetus to write a novel was I'd picked up a Mills and Boon on a cottage holiday with my parents, and we all had a laugh about this. And in my arrogance, I thought, I'm going to make a lot of money. I'm just going to write one of these things. So I dashed off in 3 weeks a Mills and Boon, as I thought, and of course it got rejected, rightly so. But then I got more serious, and I thought, well, actually, I would like to write. And so I wrote a children's book at Oxford in my spare time. And yes, it did feature a boy and a wolf and a large bear in a different setting. But I kept it. Thank goodness I kept it, because, 20 years later, or I think it was 20 years later, it gave me the idea for Wolf Brother.
I can think of a lot of people I knew at university who said they had wanted to be writers or had creative aspirations, and they would go and be a lawyer for 5 years and then stop. And almost none of them stopped, because you start earning good money, you accumulate responsibilities. It's very, very hard often to get out of that world. So tell us about your experience both in the law and getting out, and the role that your father's death played in that.
Yeah, I don't think I had a clear plan like that, but I do remember thinking, well, I'm okay at passing exams, it'll pay the mortgage, so I'll become a lawyer for a bit, and I'll write in my spare time, and we'll see where it goes. And then you get on the treadmill. I was living in Wimbledon and trailing up to the city every day. I was doing patent litigation because of the biochemical background. And it was all quite exciting to begin with, because women in those days were outnumbered 5-1 in the legal profession, so, I can show them sort of thing. But it became relentless, and you get on this sort of treadmill, and then, partnership in a few years. And I was writing at the same time in my spare time, but I had hardly any spare time. So it gradually started to come to me that, maybe I should really try to write. And then my father became ill and died, after 5 years. And I think at one point, I remember before he died, I asked him, do you have any regrets? And he said, what about my life? No. And after he died, that sort of struck me, and I thought, well, if I died now, I would have nothing but regrets because I'm not doing what I want to do. So I had some time off at the sabbatical, and then I took a deep breath and resigned, basically. And I was a partner by then, and it was quite interesting because my fellow partners, the older ones, all assumed I was going mad. Why would I give up this well-paid job? They actually thought I was having a nervous breakdown. They wanted to put out a press release to that effect. And the younger ones came up and said, well done, you're getting out. It was really along generational lines.
I'm still reeling on the press release. In that time off, you wrote the first draft of Without Charity, is that right?
That is, yes, that was my first published novel. A historical novel, which came out, I think, the year after I chucked in the law.
And we really love on the podcast to get into the mechanics of how people got their books published, particularly their first publishing deal. So could you take us, you left the law without a book contract. How did you go about getting things moving?
I'll have to correct you on that.
Okay.
But no, it's fine. I had been doing I knew nobody in publishing, and I had, over the years, I'd sent stuff off and tried to enter for various prizes and got shortlisted and then flung back into outer darkness, rejection letters, all that stuff. While I was in my final year as I didn't know it then, at my law firm, one of our clients, I worked in the intellectual property department, one of our clients was the man who ended up being, and is still, my agent. He had a intellectual property dispute. I had lunch with him, and he said, well, I'll have a look at your writing, and he liked it. So he sent what would be Without Charity to the woman who became my publisher. And while I was still there, working out my notice, I had already chucked in the law, but I had to do 6 months. He got me my first publishing contract.
I stand corrected, sorry.
No, it's, there's no... so I was actually sitting at my desk, and I had an assistant in front of me, and I got the phone call, and I knocked coffee all over my desk and all the papers, because I was so elated.
I was going to say, psychologically, that must have made a huge difference to the decision that you'd made, that you now had this deal and you were going to have a proper go at being a writer.
Yes, because for those first few months after I'd chucked it in, I was looking at, just trying to make it. And I thought, well, look, I've got enough money to write for 2 years, and then I'll have to go and live with my mother. And much as I loved my mother, that would have been a step down. But, yeah, it came just in time.
I was going to say we always ask about money on the podcast, but you've preempted us for that, so congratulations for your candor with that. Could we talk then about the beginnings of Wolf Brother? So you've alluded to the fact that this had its origins with a story you wrote as a student, but we saw that again. Was it your agent who played a role here, saying that try something different, and then it was hugely successful.
Yes. Again, I'd written, I think, 4 or 5 historical novels, which did okay, but weren't sort of bestsellers or anything. And my agent, Peter Cox, just sort of quietly was saying to me, well, look, just think about other things. You could write biography, you could write something else, crime, just blue sky. If you get an idea, just run with it for a few days or something. Okay, so that planted the seed. And then I was having a look at some stuff I'd written. I'd always kept manuscripts, and I found the manuscript, the typescript that I'd written at Oxford, and there was one paragraph written from the wolf's point of view, and I just thought, that looks quite fun. So I sat down and just had a little think about a simple story, as I then thought. Boy, girl, wolf, bear, forest. I remember thinking, that's what I want, something, really elemental. And I wrote a little sort of 1.5-page summary and sent it off to my agent. And Peter was on the phone the next day. In those days, that's how the post worked. And he said, drop everything. I said, no, but I'm under contract to write the 3rd book in the Eden trilogy. And he said, yeah, pause it, I'll deal with the publishers, drop everything. He actually said something else about how much money we could make, but I promised to him never to repeat it, because there were some swear words. But yeah, but it was that confidence that he saw in it, something that I hadn't seen, that was sort of universal potential and worldwide. But having that confident reaction from him really, really gave me an impetus to take it seriously.
Of course, we now desperately want to know how exactly he phrased it, but we'll have to live without knowing. From that point then, did you develop it into a proposal? Did you write the whole manuscript? When did it go out to publishers?
I wrote the first 6 chapters, and they were the easiest 6 chapters I've ever written. Oh gosh, in those days, happy days, they just, yes. I just wrote the first 6 chapters, obviously a bit of rewriting and things, but that world was so fresh, this boy finding himself in the dark forest and his father's dying, from a bear attack, and the bear's still out there. And sent it to Peter, and we went out with that. I did do a little bit of work. Yeah, sorry, it's coming back to me now. It's 25 years ago. I came up with a sort of vague plot, back of the envelope plot summary, and I was having so much fun, I thought, yeah, it's going to be more than just one book. So I came up with sort of very basic ideas for 6 books, and we went out with that, and had different reactions. One publisher said, oh yes, this'll fit into the Brian Jacques slot. Brian Jacques was, a well-known children's author, but as soon as they said the word slot, I thought, nobody puts Wolf Brother in a slot. So that was them. The publisher who became my wonderful editor and publisher, Fiona Kennedy, she said to me, she gave me a 2-hour cross-examination on the world I was creating, which was sort of, right, quite hard work, but I thought, I like this. And then she said, well, I really want 6 books, but I don't want these 6 books, because they're not really hanging together. And she was right, because I hadn't really thought them through. So I went off and had a little think a bit more, and then came up with what became Chronicles of Ancient Darkness.
So the figures that are reported in the media, I don't know if these are correct, are that it sold for £2.8 million, and then it has sold more than 2.5 million copies. What do you think were the factors that led to there being so much interest at the time? Was it the fact that Harry Potter had exploded 7 or 8 years beforehand and maybe shifted how the children's publishing worked, or what was going on both in the book and in the wider culture that accounted for that huge success?
Well, I think, commercial stuff, yes, Harry Potter must have helped, because I think it's a long time ago now, but some of the publicity was, is this the new Harry Potter? That was the line. That's one thing. Second thing, sorry to go on about my agent, but I mean, we realised about 6 months before the book went out that the publicity was rubbish. The publishers were, the little publicist, she was working part-time. She had a voice that made you go to sleep. She was the last person who was going to enthuse anybody. So I put up my own money and paid for a really proper publicist, external ones who had never actually publicised a book before, but they were brilliant. And they just were a bit more on the ball. But I think the really important thing, which I realised from Fiona, was that everybody, it appealed across the world to all cultures, because everybody in the world comes from a Stone Age background. We were all hunter-gatherers once. I'd never really thought about that. Plus, wolves were once as widespread as people. And so there's lots of wolf beliefs and folklore in every culture. They all know wolves. And there's a wolf in he's a main character. So I think that helped the appeal. Plus a certain amount, I hope, of good writing, but,
naturally.
Bit of luck.
Hello, listeners. This is a notice to say that we have once more improved our crowdfunding offerings.
Firstly, we now have a subscription option on Apple Podcasts, where you can hear extra exclusive content from our guests in mini episodes that come out in between the main instalments of the show.
Secondly, on Patreon, we're continuing to offer the bundle of successful journalistic pitches, which goes to anyone who contributes $5 a month or more. You can read pitches to, among others, The New York Times, The Guardian, The New Yorker, The Economist, The Washington Post, New Scientist, GQ, and the BBC. The whole compendium runs to a whopping 160 pages. Go to patreon.com, that's patreon.com/always-take-notes to see the full list of publications included in the pack.
Anyone who contributes $10 per month or more now also gains access to the exclusive mini episodes. You can listen for free to a sample mini episode with novelist Lee Child on our Patreon page. At that price point, you also get a signed copy of our book. The first 10 new sign-ups at this level will likewise receive a license to Scrivener worth £55. 7 of those are left. This specialist word processing software helps you organise long writing projects, such as novels, non-fiction books, academic papers, and even scripts.
Lastly, anyone who contributes $15 a month or more gets all of these benefits, plus an Always Take Notes mug. They can also join an exclusive monthly call with us to discuss any aspect of their writing lives, including workshopping pitches. All paid Patreons have the opportunity to chat online with other supporters of the show and also to submit questions for upcoming interviews. Once again, you can find all the offers at patreon.com/always-take-notes. With authors that have had a big smash hit, we like to ask them whether there was a moment that they realised, putting aside the fact that you got a good advance for it, but was there a moment when you realised that this was really going to take off with the public?
Well, the advance actually is no promise of that at all, and then the big fear actually was, that it was going to sort of just fall flat or something, especially when they didn't print enough books, and so in the first week they weren't available. And I remember, it's burnt into my memory, I went for one interview at the BBC and they said, a copy of Wolf Brother, which you can't buy for love or money. And I thought, crap, if you can't buy them, what's the point? So it was really up and down, actually, plus, it was very up and down. But actually, the moment, and this is going to sound so corny, but it's true, the one that I remember was I went to the Hay Book Festival for the first time. I had no idea what a book festival was. I'd never been to one. Nobody had told me what authors did or how they presented. They just said, go up there and talk about Wolf Brother. Yeah, great. Anyway, and I didn't know who was going to turn up. And I remember being led past this column of little children all clutching Wolf Brother. And I thought, they're all here to listen to me. But that was a moment when I thought, and then we had there was a lovely atmosphere. And they were just very, very nice and excited. And all these little 12-year-olds. And when I asked for questions, we had a little forest of little hands, which was lovely. And that I remember.
I was wondering if you had other kind of Neolithic set books in mind when you were writing it, because I immediately thought, as we were preparing for this, about a writer called Jean M. Auel, who I used to steal those books from my mum when I was a teenager, and she was quite embarrassed because they had quite a lot of sex in them. But these were sort of huge Stone Age hits in the 70s, 80s maybe, but was that influence, or were there other touchstones for what you were working on?
Can I just correct you? Mesolithic.
Apologies.
Just because there are readers out there who will say, why didn't she correct him? I did read the first few chapters of Jean M. Auel, or whatever how you pronounce it, the first one, Clan of the Cave Bear, and then I didn't read the rest. I didn't connect with them. I could see she'd done her research. I thought, fine, but that's as far as I went. Apart from that, I think it's William Golding. I've never believed in doing your market research. I know there are people called book coaches who say, you should research your market. Well, if I'd done that for Wolf Brother, there weren't any books apart from Jean M. Auel, and she wasn't for children. So what would that have told me? That there's no market for them, or that there's a gap in the market? Either way, you just write something because you want to write it.
How soon in the writing process did it become clear to you that you were going to alternate between perspectives?
Oh, you mean in the Wolf Brother books, that the sort of points of view of Tarak, Wren and Wolf, those are the main characters. That was right from the start, I think. Well, that was pretty much just arose from the unconscious, when he meets the wolf. As it was a cub at the time, that the next thing happened, I just wrote from the wolf's point of view. And spookily, I've always found it very easy to write from the point of view of another species. I don't know why that is, but it's just sort of liberating.
Could you tell us about your research process? You take this very seriously. You have swum with orcas, you've eaten raw seal liver and whale blubber. You travel extensively, but at least in the commentary seen elsewhere, you don't use the internet. Is that still correct?
I do use the internet now. I started using it just before the pandemic. About a week before the pandemic really hit, my agent got me on the internet, which was just as well. So I use it a bit to check dates or something. If I need to know, was October the 25th Friday in 1973 or something like that. It's great. But I don't find it, I still don't use it for proper research. Research can sound so boring. It's not really, for me, of course, you want to get facts right, you want to get it right. But what I really use research for is to get ideas. Going up to, going to the Arctic for dark matter, yes, you want to feel what it's like and the cold and everything, but you'll get so many ideas when you're up there. I mean, just one example, when I was snowshoeing in the dark in Svalbard with a guide, with a husky and a gun, because of course the polar bears, we were sort of shuffling along, 4 of us, and there was a really strange effect. I was right at the back, and there was a really strange effect. It sounded as if there was someone snowshoeing behind me, and there wasn't. And I stopped and listened and looked, and there wasn't anyone. It was clearly some sort of olfactory effect, an echo or something of the snow. It was quite a hard snow crust, but it happened. I've never read about it in books, but it happened to me, and I wasn't going crazy, so I put that in the book. Those are the sorts of things. That's really why I do the research. And it doesn't have to be, going up to the Arctic or something. The internet, a lot of us buy our books on the internet, but I was thinking about this coming here. I've had a lot of my ideas, actually for books, from just browsing in charity shops. In Wakenhurst, which is a Gothic novel I wrote, I picked up this strange book in an Oxfam shop about someone called, a medieval mystic called Marjorie Kemp, and she gave me an idea which became part of Wakenhurst, That's not targeted research. That's just sort of browsing. So research for me is, yes, it's about doing book research and looking up what the state of knowledge about mantids was for Rainforest. But it's also about just sparking ideas for the story.
You like to sort of trek to these very remote places as well on your own, normally. Yeah. Why do you prefer to do it solo? It makes me think of that thing of, when you watch a film with someone else and you're sort of watching it and you're watching them at the same time. Is it because you worry that you'd be thinking about their reaction to things as well as your own?
I just think that really is it. I just think I'm more open to impressions when I'm on my own. Because I have to be, really. Partly because, these are dangerous places, you have to keep yourself safe. And, if anyone's gone for a walk on Wimbledon Common or anywhere, if you're with a friend or a group of people, that's a nice experience. But you may not be taking in as much of your surroundings as if you're just on a walk on your own early in the morning with perhaps the dog or not. And the other thing is, it would be boring for the other person because I will keep stopping to take notes. And I have a waterproof notebook for those stormy or icy occasions. But yeah, because otherwise I'm not going to remember it all. And that would be desperately dull for them.
Looking at literary wolves kind of more generally, it's sometimes said that
literary wolves.
Literary wolves,
Okay,
yeah.
got it.
It's sometimes said that how people feel about wolves is inversely proportional to how far away from them they live. So that people in cities are very enthusiastic, and farmers who have their livestock killed have rather different opinions. How did you go about kind of using research, and how much is your wolf a wolf, as it were, and how much have you taken license?
Right. Well, there's a certain amount of license with wolf because, of course, we don't know too much about what goes on in their brain. We think they have, to be technical, a theory of mind, like collies and that sort of thing. You know, that they can understand that a separate person has a different mind to theirs from theirs. So in that sense, I've perhaps used some license. There's a bit of anthropomorphizing. I can never say that word. But I try to keep that to the minimum, and I have got to know real wolves for the research. You know, there was a wonderful wolf trust up near Reading, actually very convenient for Wimbledon, and I got to know some wolves there, and they're not completely wild. They're semi-socialized, but they're not tame. You can't tame a wolf, and so I could only go into the enclosure of a few of them, the ones that I'd got to know when they were cubs. And there's nothing cuter than a wolf cub or
There's
more.
quite a nice video of them like jumping up on you and
Oh,
stuff that
yeah.
we found.
Oh, I think there's one of me, yes. I was allowed to give them their first rabbit. This was a dead rabbit, roadkill. And I'd known these three wolves, Torak, Mai and Mosey. Torak named for my hero, not at my instigation, but it was very nice. I'd known them since they were cubs. I'd bottle fed them and burped them. You do actually have to burp wolf cubs. It's really sweet.
That feels evolutionary very, from an evolution perspective, very odd.
Well, you see, the mother licks their tummies.
True.
So we don't do that. You put your hand underneath their tummy and they give a little burp. That was too cute to put in the books. It was simply too Disney, But anyway, so all those details, but not the burping. But yes, and then I thought I think they tried to film it, and I thought I'd hold them up, the rabbit up, and these things would jump up and down. And I think one of them just jumped straight up and got it immediately, because wolves can jump from a standing start about 6 feet, no problem at all.
Lucky he didn't have a finger taken off.
Yeah, I got a thick lip from one of them. When they were grown up, they'd come and I went in, and one of them just bounced up, and they didn't mean to hurt me, but just muzzled against my mouth. And it felt like after you've had an injection at the dentist's, and I had to give an interview to camera just afterwards. But thanks, Mosey. This happens.
We also often speak to writers who've had a hugely successful book of what the experience of following that up is like. So what was it? Obviously, this was a series, not a single book, but what was it like both with Gods and Warriors, your second children's series, but then moving back to standalone adult novels?
Well, I was lucky with the Wolf Brother books that the first one was a big success, and so the pressure was on with the second one, actually. I knew what I was going to write, but I was under huge pressure of time, a book a year, and that's a lot of research, going to Greenland and all the rest of it. But I managed, and that series, the 6 books, were successful. Then Gods and Warriors, that was the Bronze Age series, and that wasn't as successful. So that was hard. That was difficult because the publishers sort of lost interest in it. They will say they didn't, but they did after the first book. But I still had to write the remaining 4. So it was down to sort of, well, I've got to stay strong for my characters and, just do the best books I can with increasing lack of interest from the publishers. So that was, that wasn't great. But then actually I'm forgetting that in between I did have Dark Matter, because I wrote Dark Matter after I'd done finished, as I thought, the Wolf Brother books. And that was nice because it was a complete change of direction. It was writing for adults again and writing a ghost story. It was scary because in a critical sense, because I thought, the knives will be out for me from the critics, they'll want to do me down. But they didn't. They were really nice. They liked Dark Matter, so that was a surprise.
Well, did it help as well from that kind of I suppose, resilience point of view, having a kind of genre novel, you had something that kind of a structure to work within, having done a series, and something that was more kind of freeform and imaginative.
I'd never really thought of that, but perhaps it did. I mean, I think what was nice about Dark Matter was that it was fairly short, and that gives you a sort of structure, you know. But it was just nice to have a change, and, you know, if it didn't work, it didn't work, and I could just do my own thing.
Sarah Perry, who we had recently on the podcast, wrote an interesting piece in The Guardian, I think a week ago, saying that she'd made a kind of conscious choice that she wanted to pursue writing fiction rather than having children. And you don't have children yourself. Now, this is not a question that male novelists put up with often, but, you know, this hugely varied and interesting and ambitious life where you've been traveling, you've been writing, would that, do you think, have been possible if you'd had kids?
I don't know, because I don't know much about children. I mean, I know I've written for them, but I'm writing for, you know, the child in me sort of thing. I think it would have been much harder. I mean, to be perfectly honest, I've never wanted children. I haven't got a maternal bone in my body, so it hasn't been an issue. I've never really wanted to be married either. I had a few boyfriends, and then I discovered that actually I'd got less enjoyment out of them than I had from gardening, and I'm not actually that keen on gardening, you know. So once I got published, I just thought, you know, this is what I want to do. This is what makes me, you know, happy. Not all the time, because it's very hard work. So, but yeah, I think I do always really admire writers who, particularly women, who have children. I think, how on earth do you manage it? You know, how do you manage it? So I admire them tremendously. I think that would be difficult, just taking off to go to Greenland or something. I mean, these days I can't, because I've got a 94-year-old mother with Alzheimer's I'm looking after, you know. But, you know, everybody has, I suppose, their own sort of family commitments.
When we interviewed male novelists, there's a lot of, I wouldn't be able to do this without my wife doing everything for me. So
yes, exactly.
That's often the answer.
Absolutely.
And tell us about how you came to live in Wimbledon. How you've built your life here. You obviously came here as a child, but your decision to stay.
Well, yeah, we moved here. I mean, it wasn't my decision to move here. My parents moved here from Essex in '69, and it's a lovely place to live. I went to school here. I bought my second flat here, and then when I became a writer, you know, when I chucked it in and became a writer, chucked in the law and became a writer, it sort of, I had friends here and things like that. But now, well, for the past 15 years, I've lived on Wimbledon Common, and that really works for me because in under 2 minutes I can be in the woods. And that really helps. You know, I can go early in the morning, sometimes when the dawn chorus is, you know, very early in May time or something like that. Plus, I live in a house, it's a Victorian house, where one of my favourite writers of ghost stories lived and died, Margaret Oliphant. And she wrote a wonderful short story called The Open Door. And so when I was my first night in my house, I don't believe in ghosts, but I did read The Open Door, and I said aloud, just in case, Margaret, you're still anthologized. And I've never had any trouble. So
there's a huge amount of discussion in the literary world at the moment about artificial intelligence and what it means for creativity and, you know, whether the machines will be able to do this. I was wondering if you have thoughts on that, and potentially if you see any commonality between these thinking machines and the supernatural and ghosts, you know, this thing that you have written or focused on so deeply.
Gosh, you know, like many people, I don't really know much about artificial intelligence, and I'm not that interested. I'm probably an ostrich there. You know, I just think I have no control over this. Instinctively, as a writer, I think it's not going to help. And if young writers try to use it, that's not going to help them, because the human brain is it's one of the most, or perhaps the most complex system in the universe. there's so much weirdness in the human brain and creativity. That's what you need to tap into. So you don't need writing courses. You don't need books telling you how to write. You just have to figure it out for yourself. That's probably going to be a very old-fashioned view. Now, in terms of where it's going to take the trade and everything, that's probably deeply frightening because, they're going to scan. I mean, my books have already been scanned and analysed and all the rest of it. God knows what, without my permission. I mean, these things are happening all the time. But I don't think it's going to produce great art. I just don't.
We are coming up to the end of our time, so as a final question from me, you've been to the jungle, to the Arctic, up mountains. Where do you think you might go next?
I haven't been anywhere since before the pandemic because of my mother. So
I mean on the page.
But I have. I see. I'm thinking of escape because I can tell you I'm going to go do the Northwest Passage.
You can tell us your holiday plans if you want.
Where am I going to go next? Well, actually, I have been writing a story for a few years, well, ever since Rainforest, and actually Rainforest elbowed it aside. This poor story. And it's a Gothic story, and so it's a little bit more like Wakenhurst, and a lot of it's set in Sussex, actually, or possibly Surrey. I haven't quite decided yet, but much more English for this one.
Wonderful. We'll look forward to that. Thank you again for coming, and thank you to Michelle.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Thank you.
That was the Always Take Notes interview with Michelle Paver. Her website is michellepaver.com. Her Instagram is michelle.paver. Her X account is @michellepaver. And Rainforest is published by Orion.
Hello, it's us again. Before we get started with the outro, we have a new supporter of the podcast to thank on Patreon. His name is John. We think it's Vigand, although it might be Wiegand, so apologies if we're butchering the pronunciation. And he's a freelancer based in the US who's had pieces in the New York Times and the MIT Tech Review. John says, I do think your podcast fills an incredibly meaningful role in mentoring writers that's hard to find outside a newsroom or university. So John, we really appreciate your support for the show. Rachel, what was your takeaway from the conversation with Michelle?
I really enjoyed the conversation with Michelle, and it was really nice to be back at Wimbledon BookFest after a few years. I think her answer at the end there about men and gardening might be my favourite podcast answer ever. But it was particularly enjoyable to hear about her very intensive research process and the dividends that yields, and also the way in which her relationships with editors and publishers has worked over the years, particularly as she was mega successful with the Wolf Brother books, but also since then. How about you?
Yeah, well, definitely a local luminary for you with her as a big Wimbledon figure. I thought she was great. You have an extremely funny line about men and gardening. We should definitely clip that and put it on social media. I think, yeah, exactly. That thing about having a hugely successful series and then kind of negotiating what comes after that was, I thought, very thoughtful. And then also as someone who'd moved from a scientific background to writing, which is rarer to writing fiction. So I thought she was thoughtful on that. Anyway, what have you been up to, Rachel, and what have you been consuming culturally?
Mostly been preparing stuff for the end of the year. There's that crunch of getting things ready before everyone leaves and goes on holiday for Christmas. So I've been mostly kind of editing and commissioning away. In terms of cultural consumption, I, like millions of other people around the world, have been watching Stranger Things now that it's returned for its final season. And I've also just taken delivery of Maggie O'Farrell's new novel, so I'm looking forward to that ahead of its publication next year. How about you, Simon?
I have had a big piece in the New Yorker, which is very exciting.
I saw, congratulations.
Thank you. So this is a story that I've been working on for, well, I suppose I started at the end of last year, but it's about the Swiss minority language Romansh, an eclectic subject. But basically this is a language that about 40,000 people speak, but only, or that it does not have one standard version. So it has 5 separate versions that are not always easily intelligible, which meant they had to print multiple school textbooks and everything. And in the 80s, there was a project to try and unify the language, to create one Romansh to rule them all. And there was then furious resistance. So it's basically about a kind of very, as the headline says, a very big fight over a very small language. But that's, it's my first print piece in the New Yorker, and that's a significant professional milestone for me. And then otherwise, I've been just kind of getting my elbows into the next round of book edits that I have to do for the end of January. And reading a lot of kind of esoteric French mountaineering literature and stuff. So lots going on. Anyway, this has been Always Take Notes, hosted by me, Simon Acomb.
And me, Rachel Lloyd.
Our producer and social media editor is Artemis Irvin. Our score is by Jessica Danheiser, and our graphic design is by James Edgar.
If you'd like to follow us on social media, we're on Instagram at Always Take Notes. We're on X at Take Notes Always. We're on YouTube at Always Take Notes, and TikTok under the same handle. And if you'd like to support us on our crowdfunding page on Patreon or get in touch with us via our website, please do.
And we should also say that Always Take Notes is now a co-production with Listening Dog Media. Many thanks. Goodbye.